citizens on President Trump's watch, and Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria, where the president has apparently abdicated presidential decision-making and left day-to-day operations to military commanders. A Russian fighter jet intercepted a U.S. spy plane over the Baltic Sea, reportedly coming within just 5 feet of that aircraft on Monday. That incident happened on the same day the Russian Defense Ministry threatened to treat any American planes fighting ISIS in Syria as targets if they fly west of the Euphrates River. There was no response whatsoever from the President of the United States on that threat from the Russian Defense Ministry. Earlier today, an American fighter jet shot down an Iranian-made armed drone that was headed in the direction of American troops in southern Syria. This is the second such drone that U.S. military shot down this month. Foreign Policy Magazine is reporting on the infighting within the Trump administration and the White House on what to do in Syria. The report says that 2 White House officials are now pushing to take wider action in Syria, but according to that report, Secretary of Defense James Mattis has personally shot down their proposals more than once. A former general has not had this much authority in the American government since Dwight Eisenhower was president.
I'm gravely concerned that we may be slipping into a hot war with Assad's forces, with Iran, or even with Russia. And we need a clear strategy from the Trump administration.
That was Senator Chris Coons of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee speaking today on Capitol Hill. Joining us now, Jeremy Bash, MSNBC national security analyst and a former chief of staff to Leon Panetta when he was the director of the CIA and Secretary of Defense at the Defense Department. Jeremy, what happens if the president simply says, you guys are in charge, defense secretary, everybody else concerned with our assets in Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, it's up to you. You don't have to check with me, make any decisions you want.
Well, national security is a team sport, Lawrence. You need every player working together. You need the State Department working in concert with the Defense Department, working in concert with the uniformed military, working in concert with the intelligence community. And it should all be put together by the National Security Advisor, reporting up to the president as the commander-in-chief. So when every player doesn't work with each other, then there's a recipe for miscommunication and ultimately failure. And I would say, Lawrence, that there has never been a time more tense than this in the skies over Syria. Let's just focus on what happened. The Russians have essentially declared a no-fly zone. That was going to be our strategy, to deny Assad's forces, to deny the Russians the ability to attack our forces on the ground and those we're supporting in the campaign against ISIS. Instead, what they basically said is, you Americans, you have to keep your planes grounded west of the Euphrates. And it's really unclear at this hour, Lawrence, whether or not the president is going to stand for it. To this minute, we have heard nothing from the president about this problem.
Well, who likes this situation? I mean, I can imagine in Henry Kissinger's White House, if the president were to say, I have absolutely no interest in anything that happens on your watch, Henry Kissinger would have been thrilled. He would have been, in effect, president of foreign policy, president of all defense policy, because in what you just described, it all flows into the National Security Advisor. And if the National Security Advisor doesn't have to check with the president, doesn't the National Security Advisor on these matters, in effect, become president?
Yeah, but I don't know any National Security Advisor or Secretary of Defense, and I would bet Secretary Mattis and General McMaster are in this category. They don't want to operate as free agents. They don't want to operate without the input from the White House, the interagency. They are used to a normal, orderly national security process. They don't like freelancing. They want to have conversation. They want to have an organized foreign policy process, and they want buy-in from the commander-in-chief. They want involvement by the president. So I actually think that they would want that. I think the problem is really a policy problem, which is that the president has to date been unwilling to push Russia out of the way in the skies over Syria. And as a result, what you've seen is you've seen Iranian drones, you've seen Syrian fighter aircraft coming to attack those forces on the ground that we are supporting. And we have troops on the ground in Syria. This is a very dangerous and delicate situation. And for the president basically to say, we're okay with Russia pushing us out of the way, I think that's unacceptable and harmful to our troops and our interests.
And we know when, according to reporting after the fact, that when we used the big bomb in Afghanistan that had never been used before, the president had pre-delegated the authority to make that decision without checking with him.
Yeah, but I gotta say, Lawrence, my sources tell me that the president was not involved in that decision at all. He took credit for it later because I think he thought it looked somehow macho, but he was not involved in that decision at all. Likewise, he was not involved in the decision at all to shoot down the Syrian aircraft, the Su-22 fighter that shot at the Syrian defense forces on the ground. The president wasn't involved in that at all. That was a decision made by the commander in the field, ultimately the Central Command Commander, General Votel, and ultimately the Secretary of Defense. And the president, again, has not been taking on the Russian forces, the Syrian air forces, and the Iranian air forces in the skies over Syria.
Jeremy, how would it have changed your job at the Defense Department, working for the Secretary of Defense, if you were sitting there waiting for presidential decisions that simply were not coming?
That would have been unacceptable. I mean, time matters. Again, when lives are on the line, you don't have a lot of time to waste. Some of this authority should be pre-delegated. The rules of engagement should be set forth to the Secretary of Defense and to the commanders on the ground. And then if there are any adjustments to make, you take that back to the National Security Council, have conversation in that interagency group, and ultimately take things to the president. If the president is not involved, or more specifically, if the president is unwilling to take the fight to Russia in the skies over Syria, again, that is a very dangerous situation.
Jeremy Bash, thank you for sharing your expertise and experience with us again tonight. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Lawrence.
Tonight's Last Word is next. John Ossoff has just finished speaking in Georgia. We're going to bring you some of his comments as soon as we have that video ready. Today, White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer continued to answer questions about Russia as if he was a mafia foot soldier being asked about the family business.
Does President Trump believe that the Russian government interfered in the 2016 elections?
I think I have not sat down and talked to him about that specific thing. Obviously, we've been dealing with a lot of other issues today.
Joining us now, Glenn Thrush, White House correspondent for the New York Times and an MSNBC contributor, and Ron Klain, former chief of staff to Vice Presidents Joe Biden and Al Gore, and a former senior aide to President Obama. He's also former chief counsel of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and he was chief of staff to Attorney General Janet Reno. Glenn Thrush, so I think Sean Spicer's answer was a very good answer to be able to give to the FBI, if it is true. I have not discussed any of this with the boss. That is the safest place to be in an FBI investigation, if it's true.
Well, look, one thing I will say, it wasn't a very satisfying, or it didn't seem especially credible to people who were in the room at the time, but it is noteworthy that Spicer's elocution on this issue has changed dramatically, I would say, over the last 6 weeks. And I think what it really illustrates, Lawrence, is a realization on the part of Trump's staff. And by the way, we should say people are beaten down, they're demoralized, they feel like the boss doesn't have their back. I just think there is a sense now that people need to protect themselves. And Spicer's comments, the way that he is talking about this, were a lot less constrained 6 weeks ago before things got much more serious.
Glenn, you mean they were more defensive and more kind of combative with the questions?
He would assert things as if they were fact.
Yes.
He would say, he is now saying things that we're used to hearing from press secretaries. The president says, to the best of my knowledge. I have not discussed that with him. These are, I don't believe Spicer is lawyered up. I think he will have to, and I think many people in the West Wing will have to, even if they haven't come to that realization yet. But in general, you're hearing Spicer and other spokespeople like Sarah Huckabee Sanders being far more equivocal. They're not saying things, not stating things as if they were uncontested fact. The hyperbole has really tempered itself. I think it's noteworthy to notice now that they are putting things in terms of the arena of responsibility of the president and some of the other advisors, and not taking it on themselves.
Ron Klain, Sean Spicer's under no public obligation to disclose that he has been consulting a lawyer or has hired a lawyer. But when you listen to the distinctions Glenn is showing us in the way Sean Spicer speaks now, it's the way a lawyer would tell him to speak.
Yeah, I think it could be. He may have a lawyer. He may just have gotten some good advice. But I think, you know, he also is supposed to be at that podium representing the point of view of the president. And the president earlier, months ago, had acknowledged Russia had intervened in our election. And I think the biggest question for us as citizens is, if you have Russia, who intervened in our election in 2016 and is threatening to do so again in 2018, 2020, how can we have confidence that our president is supposed to be defending us from that when his press secretary can't acknowledge that the threat exists? The press secretary says he doesn't know if the president really believes the threat exists. And his attorney general testified last week that he hasn't been briefed on this threat. So I think as Americans, we should be concerned about whether or not we're really being protected from this threat to our democracy going forward if our president and our attorney general seem oblivious to the threat.
And Ron, the lawyer up news of the day is that the top lawyer in the American government now has a lawyer. Attorney General Jeff Sessions now has hired private outside counsel to represent him in this investigation. It's been a long time since the Attorney General of the United States has had to hire outside private defense counsel.
It's true, and it's a fascinating hire, Lawrence. It's a man named Charles Chuck Cooper. He's from Alabama. He's said to be a close confidant of the Attorney General. He's one of the most distinguished conservative lawyers in Washington, a blue-chip lawyer. But his specialty is arguing at the Supreme Court. In fact, earlier on it had been rumored that he would be Trump administration chief lawyer for the Supreme Court. And so hiring him for this is a little bit like hiring a brain surgeon, you know, when you have like a hip problem. It's hard to explain, except for this. He is a close confidant of the Attorney General. He helped him get ready for his confirmation hearings. And it's possible what this hiring is really about is extending attorney-client privilege to whatever Jeff Sessions told Chuck Cooper to make sure that Chuck Cooper can't be asked about that. And that confidence, whatever confidences he shared with Cooper, are now shielded by the attorney-client privilege.
Oh, that's a great point. And so, Glenn, that leaves open the possibility that the Attorney General could hire more experienced criminal defense counsel to add to this team if he needs it. But right now, if you want to ask any questions of the person who helped prepare Jeff Sessions for his confirmation hearing testimony, you can't really do that. And that testimony is the subject of a possible perjury investigation.
Yeah.
Well, I have to say, I'm just blown away by that point. I'd forgotten that Ron was counsel to the Judiciary Committee. I guess we just found out how he earned his money, right?
It's why I always include it in Ron's title.
Thank you, Lawrence.
He was at the Judiciary Committee, and I was at another committee when he was at that committee, so I never forget it. But
I would not have come up with that one.
Right.
But look, I think what's really interesting is to contrast the hires. You know, Pence is lawyered up. Sessions now has. I think you're totally right. These legal teams seem to be billowing. I think the one really interesting dynamic is Trump's legal team seems to also be sort of his PR team. Jay Sekulow has been on practically every show throwing bombs. I think tonight on Fox he said that there ought to be a grand jury investigating former FBI Director Comey. I think what is really odd about Trump's legal team is they seem to be just as much involved in doing sort of communications work, because I think there is a sense in the White House that they have not been able to form a counterattack. What was very interesting also, again, because I can speak to the comm stuff a bit more than I can speak to the legal stuff, is we had a situation today where we were on day 8 of Sean Spicer or Sarah Huckabee not giving an on-the-record briefing in front of cameras. We sort of we kind of shamed them into doing it, I believe. I don't know that for a fact. But there is a reason. They do not want to have people out there making more statements that can, you know, that can ultimately redound to them in these legal proceedings.
All right, we're going to go live to Georgia now. Karen Handel is giving her victory speech in the special congressional election there. Let's listen to this.
To take a minute to acknowledge a new friend that I was able to make over the course of that campaign, and that was Majority Whip Steve Scalise. Right up until that tragic day on the ball field, Steve would drop me a text message every single week just to make sure I was doing okay and hanging tough. I think he even called me the Terminator in one of them. Wasn't sure about that one, Steve, but hasta la vista. Let me just tell you. But really and truly, what happened on that ball field was a terrible tragedy. And we need to all continue to lift up Steve and the others who were injured that day. And we need to also lift up this nation so that we can find a more civil way to deal with our disagreements. Because in these United States of America, no one should ever feel their life threatened over their political beliefs and positions. And I say that, ladies and gentlemen, in regards to both sides of the political aisle. Through this campaign, I have had a really great joy of getting to know any number of our leaders in Washington. And let me tell you, even though within our own GOP family we sometimes have disagreements, these are fine men and women who are doing their level best for this country. I really am honored to be able to stand before you tonight and so extraordinarily humbled. But as everyone knows, most big things are not accomplished by one person alone. And I had a tremendous amount of support in this campaign from each and every one of you to a great campaign team. They really are. Yes, give them a hand.
That's Karen Handel giving her victory speech in Georgia in the special election there tonight. Here is what John Ossoff had to say a bit earlier before Karen Handel came out to speak.
Friends, I called Secretary Handel. No, please. I commended her on a hard-fought race and on her victory this evening. Now, let me address you. The more than 12,000 of you who, as darkness has crept across this planet, have provided a beacon of hope for people here in Georgia, for people across the country, and for people around the world.
Last night, Fallon had Will Ferrell.
I want to promise you that this administration is literally working around the clock with leaders in the United States Senate to move forward legislation in the very near future that will repeal and replace Obamacare.
Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell protected the Republican candidate Karen Handel in the Georgia congressional election by refusing to release any details of the health care bill until after that election. Senator McConnell says voters in the Georgia 6th congressional district and the rest of the country can find out what he has in mind for their health care on Thursday of this week. Joining us now, Ezra Klein, editor-in-chief of Vox.com, and Sam Stein, senior politics editor of Huffington Post, soon to be politics editor of The Daily Beast. He's also an MSNBC contributor. Ezra, as of 10:21 p.m. tonight, what do we know about the Senate bill?
We don't know a ton about its details, but I think we know its broad outlines, which is like the House bill. What the Senate bill is going to do is take hundreds of billions of dollars we are currently spending to provide health insurance to poor people, and it is going to move that to provide tax cuts to rich people. That is the core of the first bill. It's going to be the core of, from everything we can tell, of this bill as well. It's going to cause massive disruption in the healthcare system. And one point I want to make, because I think this has been underplayed in coverage, Republicans keep saying, and this is really what I hear when I talk to them on the Hill, that they need to pass this or something like it because they promised to repeal and replace Obamacare. When they promised that, they also told their voters and all voters that they were going to get more coverage. Donald Trump said everybody's going to be covered. Mitch McConnell said the problem with Obamacare is it leaves 25 million people uncovered. And they said there'd be lower deductibles and lower copays. And this bill does none of those things. It's going to have fewer people covered, higher deductibles, higher copays. So it is a breaking of that promise. And there's no reason to think the Senate bill will be any different than the House bill on that score.
We know that Democrats are unsatisfied with the process. We know that the Democrats are all complaining about being shut out and having no information about this bill. Republicans are making the same complaint. Let's listen to Senator John McCain.
Senator McConnell, you must be very confident that this bill is going to pass, number one. And number two, are you willing to burn a reconciliation package if it's not?
We're going to make every effort to pass a bill that dramatically changes the current health care law.
But that's not confidence necessarily. I mean, you wouldn't bring a bill up unless you were confident, right?
Are you satisfied with the process that's being undertaken right now?
No, of course not.
Why not?
For the obvious reason that no one has been shared it. We used to complain like hell when the Democrats ran the Affordable Care Act. Now they're doing the same thing.
Sam Stein, at least one Republican is consistent about this.
Well, yes. I think the complaints about process that we're hearing now, though, are a bit of a smokescreen. And in the end, a lot of these senators will end up voting for a bill, even if they have concerns about the process. I think the one quip I would take, the one criticism I would have about McCain's statement is that he said at the end of it that Republicans are now doing the same thing that Democrats did in 2009, 2010. In fact, the process in 2009, 2010, while it was much maligned by Republicans, was objectively open and transparent with regards to any passage of major legislation that you can imagine. There were dozens of committee hearings, dozens and dozens of amendments that are offered. I'm sure Ezra has the exact numbers probably in the back of his head. But it was widely open. I mean, if you remember at roughly this point in time in constructing that health care bill, Barack Obama was bringing Republican leaders to the Blair House so that he could hear their ideas and then turn some of those ideas into legislative language in the final product of the bill. So it's not the same as what's happening in 2009, 2010. It's demonstrably worse.
Mike Lee is one of the people who was on this just quickly assembled group of people. I don't want to call it a committee because it is not a Senate committee. There is a Senate committee who has jurisdiction over this, but they've been ignored. And let's listen to Mike Lee's complaints about this.
I've had a lot of people ask me specifically when the health care bill is going to be released to the public, why it isn't public. The short answer to the question is I haven't seen it yet either. Even though I've been a member of this working group among Senate Republicans assigned to help narrow some of the focus of this, I haven't seen the bill. And it has become increasingly apparent in the last few days that even though we thought we were going to be in charge of writing a bill within this working group, it's not being written by us. It's apparently being written by a small handful of staffers for members of the Republican leadership in the Senate. So if you're frustrated by the lack of transparency in this process, I share your frustration. I share it wholeheartedly.
Ezra, how can senators make statements like that and then find their way to voting for this?
I think that statement's so amazing. I am part of the secret working group. If you are frustrated by secret working groups, just know I'm not part of the super secret working group and have now decided that you are right and I share your frustration. Look, I think there's a big point to be made about all this, which is that there is a reason Republicans have kept to a very secret process here. Sam brought up, I think, properly the Blair House event in 2010, I think it was. And at that moment, what happened was the Affordable Care Act was under fire. Its passage looked at the very least hazy. Barack Obama, President Obama, then invited Republicans and Democrats to the Blair House for a nationally televised multi-hour debate over the bill. And the reason he did that was the Democrats believed then and at every point during that no matter what the polls said, if they could tell the American people what was in their bill, that the American people would like it. Republicans have exactly the opposite belief. They believe that if the American people have time to look at what is in their bill, they will not like it. And so the best thing to do is to pass it as quickly as possible with as little debate as possible and move on from it forever. And that is a approach that just it's grotesque when you're dealing with the health care and the lives of this many people. To pass something you know people are going to hate and keep it secret because you know it wouldn't survive if you didn't, that's just not a moral way to do this.
Yeah, Sam, there's only one reason why you keep legislation secret, and that is that you know from the moment you make it public, you are only going to lose votes.
Yes. I mean, what I hear when I talk to any healthcare activist or staffer on the Hill working on this issue, both sides of the aisle, is that what we're essentially witnessing is a game of legislative hot potato. No one wants to own this thing, and so they keep passing it along to someone else. The House got it out of their chamber, thankfully, to give it to the Senate. Now the Senate doesn't want to be touching this thing, but they're probably, in likelihood, going to pass it, get it to conference committee. At some point, this thing either fails or it passes through. So Ezra was right. They want to get it done, they want to get it passed and move on quickly. But at some point, it does become law. And at some point, that law, which is polling in roughly the mid to low 20s, will have a tangible impact on people, and there will be a political price to pay, presuming that they can't get those numbers up. It's just no one wants to pay that price now. No one wants to see it go down for defeat.
Ezra, as we know, for this to become a law, there have to be at least 3 more votes on this bill, on a bill, one in the Senate, and then both the House and the Senate will each have to have another vote on what would presumably be yet a third bill, but that one has to be in identical form, pass both bodies in order to get there. There are plenty of places for this legislation to die between here and that finish line, and I can't help but wondering if Mitch McConnell wants to see it die after he just squeaks a vote through the Senate so that the members of the Senate who want to say, I voted for something, can say they voted for something, even though they won't be able to say it became law.
I think that might be right. There's been a lot of speculation, but I'm not sure even if it is right, it means the bill won't pass. And the reason is this. We've seen it every point.
It might pass by mistake, in other words.
But it seems to be the case. It's like a collective action problem. Yeah. Everybody wants to stop it, but nobody wants to be the one who stopped it, right? No faction wants to be blamed. No chamber wants to be blamed. And so this thing keeps moving inexorably forward because nobody wants to take the blame for destroying a bad bill, but having to go before Republican primary voters and say, we're the reason we didn't repeal and replace Obamacare. So yeah, Mitch McConnell might just be trying to get it out of his hands for now, but then you go right back to the same dynamics again. Again, it is the worst possible way and the worst possible reason to craft and pass legislation I have ever watched.
Ezra Klein and Sam Stein, thank you both for joining us.
Lawrence.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
In Georgia, John Ossoff has just conceded the race to Karen Handel. Coming up, a new poll shows some Republicans turning against the president in significant numbers now. Well, that 6th congressional district in Georgia has not been represented by a Democrat since we had a Democratic president from Georgia. Most of Georgia has embraced the Republican Party since Jimmy Carter was president. In the congressional election in this district in November, the Republican won by 24 points. That's the race that's locked in this virtual tie right now. 24 points last time voters went to the polls there. Polls showed that Democrat John Ossoff and Republican Karen Handel are in a virtual tie coming into today's election. The latest returns tonight show that with 80% of the vote counted, Karen Handel leads with 52.4% to John Ossoff's 47.6% of the vote. The special election comes as President Trump's support among Republicans is falling. According to a new CBS poll today, in April, 83% of Republicans approved of President Trump. Now 73% of Republicans approve of the president, according to the CBS poll. Joining us now from John Ossoff headquarters in Atlanta is Garrett Hake, MSNBC correspondent. Garrett, what's the feeling there?
Lawrence, the bottom just fell out in this room here. Another network just called this race for Ossoff's Republican opponent, and what little energy had been in the room a few minutes ago completely evaporated. It started to disappear about half an hour to 45 minutes ago when the votes from today started to come in, and we saw Ossoff's lead in the early votes start to slowly disappear. About 30 minutes ago, Ossoff's fiance came out and thanked the volunteers and staff, started talking about small victories like volunteers that got signed up, new voters here in the district. Important stuff, sure, but not the kind of thing that was going to rally this crowd. And Lawrence, I think we'll have plenty of time for smarter people than me to debate and analyze what happened here, but two, I think, obvious takeaways so far. First, as fired up as the Democrats were in this district, and I don't know if you can get a sense of the room behind me and the scope of this, but I've not seen anything like this in a House race I have ever covered. I mean, hundreds of people here. They've been dancing and drinking for hours, fired up about a House race. It turns out the Republicans were just as fired up too. In the places she needed to win, Karen Handel's voters showed up and they cast the ballots. And that's sort of the second thing that I think is going to be noteworthy about this, is even having essentially more money than he can spend, probably about $25 million in total. Jon Ossoff couldn't buy an extra 10,000 or so Democratic voters in this very, very red district, the district that Tom Price had won by more than 20. So despite President Trump's struggles, some of those conservatives are going to still be conservatives. And if Democrats are going to make those big gains in 2018, they're going to have to crack a code that they couldn't quite crack here, despite being, the Democrats I talked to, pretty satisfied with their candidate and how they ran this race, really right down to the very end.
Garrett Haake, thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciate it. MSNBC's Steve Kornacki is standing by at the board, taking a deep dive into what we know about these votes counted so far. Steve.
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't think our networks called it, but frankly, I can't look at this and give you a scenario where Jon Ossoff wins. We can show you with Karen Handel leading by 5 points here. We can show you how she has found herself in this position. There's a couple things that I would key in on. Number one, it was the early vote. Now, think about this. All the emphasis Democrats put on organizing, on mobilizing, all the attention Democratic activists paid, and the general advantage we've seen Democrats tend to have in early voting here and elsewhere. Well, today in the early vote, Jon Ossoff did win the early vote. He won it by 1.4%. The early vote, the in-person early vote, he wanted to be well north of 50% there, because in the same day vote, the people actually turning out and voting today, it looks like Karen Handel well over 55% of those. And that's the other key here. It's right here, Cobb County. This is the Republican part of the district. This is the core Republican part of the district. Not much of an early vote there to speak of, but a very big same-day vote overwhelmingly for Karen Handel. So Democrats did not get what they wanted out of the early vote. The Republicans did better there than expected. And then when you got to the same day, boy, those Republicans in the Republican heart of the district, they were motivated. And the bottom line, yeah, you mentioned been a while since the Democrats won this district. 1992 is when this district was basically created as a House district, but also this is a district where Donald Trump only won by a single point, and that was the key for Democrats tonight. Could they improve on what Hillary Clinton did in this district, and what would that mean for other districts nationwide? Well, you look where Ossoff is right now. He basically hasn't improved on Hillary Clinton at all. This is pretty much where she landed last fall.
Steve, let me interrupt you with NBC's call on this. NBC is now projecting that Karen Handel will be the winner in this race when all the votes are counted. Steve.
Yeah, no, and that's, again, that was just, this is one of those districts, if you look for national implications here, look, symbolism is probably the biggest thing here. Republicans wanted to say, hey, we could defend this turf. Democrats wanted to say, hey, we got to win on the board. But a big thing Democrats are looking at in 2018, we hear about these all the time, these districts where a Republican represents them, where Hillary Clinton won, where Hillary Clinton came within 5 points. Well, here is sort of that quintessential district. It's filled with these college-educated, white, Republican-leaning, suburbanite voters. Hillary Clinton almost beat Donald Trump after Mitt Romney had won this thing by 20-plus points in 2012. It was a district that didn't really like Donald Trump that much, and yet again, Republicans did get mobilized and did get activated here. It looks like as much as Democrats were. There was so much attention on that Democratic mobilization. Looks like when Democrats did that, Republicans got fired up too, and we basically have a result here. That Ossoff number, that looks like Hillary Clinton's number from last November.
Steve Kornacki, thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Joining us now, Steve Schmidt, Republican strategist and MSNBC political analyst. Also joining us, Jason Johnson, politics editor at TheRoot.com and an MSNBC contributor. And Steve Schmidt, there are two comparisons being made here on Ossoff's vote. His vote is being compared to Hillary Clinton's vote, which is a choice for president, not a House member. And the vote is being compared to the last congressional race in that district. Which one of those comparisons is the one that Republicans should be looking at tonight to contemplate their strength in the congressional election in 2018?
Look, Lawrence, if you're a House campaign strategist, I think you're sitting there tonight going, thank God we pulled it out. Just because the seawall held doesn't mean the storm wasn't fierce and the waves weren't large. This is an overwhelmingly Republican district. Mitt Romney getting 66% of the vote. Donald Trump coming down to 49%. Tom Price getting elected somewhere between 68% to 61% in his elections. So this is an ominous win for Republicans. When you look at the $23 million raised by grassroots donors, where you see that energy, the Democrats were tapping on the glass in this overwhelmingly Republican district. And when you look at how the Democrats get into the majority, you have a 24-seat majority, 23 seats that Secretary Clinton carried that are represented by a Republican. And I think what you're seeing is the new battleground of American politics are these suburbs where affluent, white, college-educated Republican voters who are uncomfortable with Donald Trump, I think, are likely to be swing voters in 18, in 2020. As the Republican Party's gotten more red, it's become more rural. As the Democratic Party's become more blue, it's become more urban, and that's left the suburbs as a battlefield. And I think we saw one of the early battles of it playing out in this race, which was surprisingly close.
Jason Johnson, if you're a Republican in the House of Representatives and you won your seat with less than 20% of the vote, what do you feel like tonight?
You're not all that encouraged. I mean, you have to look at Karen Handel and think, like, they basically spent $23 million. They pretty much spent like Tom Brady's salary to keep a seat that had been in Republican hands for 20 years. That's not something that you want to have to think about if you're a Republican next year heading into 2018, knowing that the public is going to be more energized, more excited, and possibly unhappy about the health care bill. Look, at the end of the day, and I agree with Steve in this regard, you know, this was a plus 9% registration district for the Republicans. They should have won this. The fact that it was even close, and the fact that this much money had to be spent, I don't think any Republican is comfortable right now, because most can't raise $23 million to stop someone who's challenging them.
And Steve Schmidt, we saw in South Carolina a surprisingly close race tonight in that special election that people did not have their eye on, expecting it to be that close.
If you go back to 1993, Lawrence, when Bill Clinton was pretty unpopular in that first term, you had two special elections that dropped into the Republican column out along the Mississippi River, the Kentucky 1, the Kentucky 2 districts, and that showed us that something was brewing for 1994. I think when you look right now, you consider the fact that the incumbent president's party has only picked up seats in that first midterm 3 times in the last 118 years. You look at the dispersion of those congressional districts that Hillary Clinton carried, represented by a Republican. You consider the president's approval numbers in the mid-30s, the health care bill, the lack of an ability by this Republican leadership to move an agenda forward. There are a lot of ominous wins out there if you're a competitive member of Congress. And remember, most members of Congress are as likely to lose their seat as a member of the old Soviet Politburo. But for that special category that are in competitive races, they probably have a nauseous feeling tonight watching this Georgia 6 race.
Jason Johnson, what's going to happen in this Georgia 6 district next year in the 2018 election? Will John Ossoff try to jump back in and try to rerun this race?
No one's going to admit that now, Lawrence, but that's what's going to happen. Look, they're just going to keep focusing on Karen Handel. This is an important thing, and I think this is key. This difference between sort of being on the outside and really being here on the ground and talking to some of the folks who are canvassing. There wasn't actually a tremendous amount of enthusiasm for either Karen Handel or John Ossoff. This was really a referendum on Trump in a district that more or less was still going to vote for him. But within the year, as Karen Handel gets saddled with some of the same policy issues that have made Trump unpopular, I think she's going to be a #1 target for John Ossoff next year. He's not falling off the map. People are going to stay enthusiastic. I wouldn't be surprised if we get a rematch next year, and the result may turn out to be different.
And Steve Schmidt, in the 2018 congressional elections, the Republicans in Congress are either going to be defending a bill that they voted for on health care that has been signed into law, or they're going to be defending, to some constituents, their failure to get a bill on health care signed into law.
Yeah, ultimately, it's damned if you do, damned if you don't. Nobody has any idea, of course, what's in it, what it costs, how many people will lose their insurance, its impact. Whether you think Obamacare is a good idea or a bad idea, should it be repealed or not, you know, certainly the method that they're following, no public hearings, no public vetting of it, no ability for people who will be affected by it to weigh in, it's not going to have a good outcome. And already the House bill has a 17% approval level, out across the country. When you look at the agenda and the degree to which it's stuck, and you look at how energized Democrats are at some of these districts, Republicans are going to have their work cut out for them in 2018. They're heading into a big headwind, and they're going to have a difficult problem answering a pretty simple question, which is, the first check we get at the polls of how's Donald Trump doing? What are they going to say when people ask the question, do you think he's doing a good job as president? That's tough for Republican candidates in these marginal districts to answer in a way that doesn't make them look like fools or turn off Trump supporters. So they have some difficult hours ahead, I suspect, as we start to move into this 18 cycle.
Let's take a look at what Paul Ryan is going to be facing. This is Randy Bryce, who's already announced that he wants to run as a Democrat against Paul Ryan. Speaker's seat is supposed to be a safe seat. But let's take a look at how Randy Bryce wants to run against Paul Ryan.
Paul Ryan, come up and say a few words. Congratulations on a job well done.
To represent this district because I'm a working person. If somebody falls behind, we're so much stronger if we carry them with us. That's the way I was raised. You look out for each other. I think it's time, let's trade places. Paul Ryan, you can come work the iron, and I'll go to D.C.
Jason Johnson, it looks like every Republican might just have a serious Democratic challenger.
Yeah. This is akin to when Republicans were chasing after Daschle a couple of years ago. You don't usually see serious challengers against party leadership, but this is the thing, Lawrence, and this is a big political science issue that I think, again, is the sort of the big question that Republicans have to look at. The enthusiasm on the side of Democrats is attracting better candidates, and better candidates are forcing people to have to defend a flank that they couldn't have to do before. And so I think we're already going to see, I bet you later on this summer, you're going to see more and more Republicans decide, you know what, I may retire. I don't want to have to spend the next 18 months raising $1.5 million to protect myself. And when you see something like this happening in Paul Ryan's own backyard, it's really a shot across the bow for any Republican out there to defend this administration, which is sinking faster than any poll numbers people can imagine.
Steve Schmidt and Jason Johnson, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Lawrence. Thank you.
Coming up, the voters are turning against both the president in the latest poll and the president's what is now secret health care bill being managed by Senator Mitch McConnell.
Appreciate it. Thanks to you at home for joining us this hour on an exciting night. Tonight we are watching two congressional elections play out, one in Georgia, one in South Carolina. Polls closed, as you know, at 7 p.m. Eastern time. 4 Republicans left seats in the House of Representatives in order to become officials in the Trump administration instead. That opened up all of their seats, right? All 4 of those people represented districts that were not necessarily swing districts, that are considered red districts, Republican districts. But the special elections that we've